Welcome to another episode of the Trees and Lines podcast. On part one of this two-part episode, Dr. Anand Persad, chair of UAA Research Committee, joins us to discuss the evolution of safety in the vegetation management industry. Have a listen. Hope you enjoy.
Welcome, Anand. Thanks for joining our podcast today. If you would, why don't you start us off by giving us your background, a little bit of your personal story, and I guess as a researcher, you get to pursue whatever you want to. So tell us a little bit about those things you're most passionate about.
Thanks, Phil. It's great to be here, and I don't get to pursue everything that I want to, but a little bit of my background. I grew up, as you know, in the Caribbean. We have, a lot of influence from England there. Went to school in the English system, did a lot of my examinations out of the UK. Then started, at the University of the West Indies, undergrad and then postgrad, and eventually here at the University of Florida, continued the education and worked on a whole slew of topics in the natural area, biological control. Get into the high fidelity PCR world was interesting, and then started a career. Had a choice of academic in the at the university or corporate or hybrid, and I chose hybrid. So I've been that hybrid person for the past 18, 20 years, keeping some academia, keeping involvement in academia and supervising grad students along the way, but being a player in the adaptive research world in the industry. And that's what gets me here to be able to talk to you guys today, I guess.
Yeah, good. I just got to spend a week with Dr. Anand Persad in Belize. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. But boy, the number of things you've been involved with over the years is just amazing. I know now you're got to focus on safety. Tell us about some of the research you're doing and all the findings.
Yeah, this is great because it's come full circle. I used to, in my postdoc, look at the human brain and their relationship to insect bites and encephalitis and mosquito-borne diseases and so forth. And I never thought in my wildest dream that it would come full circle, because some of the things that go on when you have these issues, things like zoning out, things like not paying attention, things like being able to move between a cognizant and the state where where you know what you're doing, sorry, to an emotional state and back, is delayed. Well, we're seeing that in our everyday lives, and I don't think everybody's been bitten by mosquitoes. So it's great to be able to revisit this in terms of safety. And one of the things I've been doing is analyzing near misses and fatalities in our industry over the past few years, and there are some findings consistent with the fact that we're not paying attention sometimes, and why is the big question, and that's been a journey, and and I spoke about it at the Women's in Veg Management and the last Trees and Utilities, and we can probably talk a little bit about it here as well.
I wanted to understand a little bit more about your decision to keep a foot in the research side of things, right? You said you've been kind of splitting between some of your professional time and your academic time. What does that split look like?
Yeah, Tej, it's been the way that I've always lived my life. I've been very, very questioning, as as a kid growing up, why, and in the corporate world, there was a lot of, this is how you do it, and my questions have always been, why don't we do it this way? And I've been what some people would call me a disruptor, for want of a better phrase. And when you're doing that, you do need to have some sort of research that goes into why do you do this, and can it be done in a different way, in a better way, in a more timely manner, and so forth. So my life and my it's been one of my passions, really, is to find out more around why things are the way they are.
He's a disruptor, Tej. You can relate to that.
Yeah, no, I definitely can. Yeah, for sure. A lot of your research is going to be dependent on the quality of the data that you're able to get. And how are you able to get your data? Do you have enough of it? to kind of prove out some of the conclusions that you're kind of pointing to?
Yeah, it's all factual. It's all accidents or near misses, or in some cases it's surveys. So it does get into a little bit of the abstract world. As you know, research is an art and a science, right? And it does get into that world where we ask people in, a group of warm buddies, hey, what are your thoughts on this? And then we distill some sort of relationship from this is what people are saying and this is what we are seeing. And then we look for alignment. Oh, we try to find the gaps, and then we try to see how can we work in the industry to reduce the gaps, or to take some of that air out of the gap.
So, Nan, I know one of our recent conversations you talked about how diversity impacts the way people see safety. Maybe there's a difference between men and women or other cultural differences. Do you have findings around that?
Oh, absolutely. So there are several great bodies of work out there that show when people are together for an extended period, they do start to think alike. And it's studies done in isolated tribes. And for example, there are tribes in Africa that they've lost the ability amongst themselves to know if somebody's fearful, because it's they've worked together for so long that they become, we call it nose blind if we have a pet in the apartment. I call this loosely brain blind, where we basically, it may not be the best appropriate words, but where we work together as a team, so we don't have that outside perspective, or a perspective from another angle. And if, for example, everybody, let's say on a bus, is really, really, really um, fearful of a lion and on a safari coming on the bus, then somebody may do something awkward, like get out of the bus and run. Or they may all get out of the bus and be so fearful that lion is going to come out of the bus. If, however, you have a few brave souls who are there to say, hey, that lion is not going to get on the bus, then you're going to have a sweet spot where people are going to say, well, okay, let's get to the middle. There's a potential for the lion coming on the bus, but we're not going to get out and run. So that's sort of where having that perspective and that diversity of thought helps us.
Can you share some of your conclusions on the different demographics and what you've seen in terms of the people that are taking the high risk work, what their demographic looks like, and how they're interpreting safety and some of the topics versus some of the decision makers and folks that focus more on the corporate side of things? Like, what have you been able to draw out as it relates to this industry?
Yeah, well, it's as you know, it's very dynamic, Tej, and things are changing all the time.
Yeah, for
There are
sure.
two fronts. There are two fronts on that. When we look at it, a lot of the incidents that I've recorded and looked at tend to be overreach. It tends to be that last effort or that last task at the end of the day, or the end of the week, or someone, or someone, either there are two peaks, either very early in your career or very late in your career. And the scary thing is that it's both almost it's almost the same amount of incidents happening. The people, the folks in the middle of the road tend to have, and that's where a mix, right? We have a mix of of careers, and it comes in, and they tend to be safer as a pool. The
Yep.
second piece has to do with gender. Men and women do think about things differently, and it extends in our industry as well. And this is one of the things we want to take into account as hiring managers when we mix our work teams that are out there. Women, for some research that we've done, if women are given a free choice, and a pool of men are given a free choice to discuss what keeps them up at night, what are some of the research, what are some, sorry, of the factors that go into their personal security and so forth, or their security on the job, the women by far and large tend to focus on PPE and things that secure themselves. So things like, we don't think about, like cybersecurity would keep them up at night. Things like having the good PPE. Men, on the other hand, focus a lot on things like driving, and whereas women don't put a huge emphasis on driving, one would think that maybe it's understood for them that they already think that everyone should be a safe driver. So we're not going to, spend gray matter on that. And that's kind of where we see differences in our industry. And it's a plug for having a gender mixed group out there, because like that line on the scenario with the bus, having mixed teams.
How receptive is the industry to that type of research, right? Where you're trying to distill things by these unique differences in individuals. Has the industry, or have you ever seen folks in the industry say, okay, that's pretty interesting. We're going to use that information and then data, and we're going to modify who we put in leadership positions as it relates to safety or execution or operations?
I think we live in interesting times, and it's starting to get a foothold. The times, the era now that change is upon us, and change seems to be there. It just seems to be changing more and more. Change seems to be the constant. We are finding more. I'm certainly finding a more open door to this sort of emergence. Sort of emerging topics, and it's getting traction, let's say. Certainly at the last Trees and Utilities, it was a very popular discussion point, and I think back to your point on culture, there's been there are records and research done that cultural, bringing folks from different cultural backgrounds together does bring a common sense of improvement in the way the final product manifests itself, because you get different perspective.
It's a complicated conversation, especially in our current environment today, because there's lots of discussion around, equality, rightfully so, right? Keeping things in balance. But I think you bring up a really interesting point where, you want to almost take advantage of some of these differences that the data shows and put people in a position where you get a better return on sort of effort and work and the sharpness of something. How do you sort of prevent yourself from, losing sight of a bigger sort of objective?
I think the key here is always looking at what's next. As a researcher, you're always there looking at the emerging concepts, and you do contribute to building out some of the established information, but there's always data, and interpretation of that data helps drive information, and that's what our role as adaptive researchers. And I use the word adaptive because we're looking at real world situation, and the development of ourselves, development of our industry, and advancing our industry. We want to leave, as researchers, we do want to leave the world a better place, and by getting into the emerging concepts, and you're right, it could lead you down into a wormhole. The thing is, we have to be. That's why I use the word adaptive research a lot. You got to be pragmatic. So we're not here looking at necessarily, too much abstract stuff material, but keep our feet grounded in the real world. That helps.
I think about safety, in the United States here, and everybody starts a chainsaw, they got their PPE on, the steel toe boots, and everything else. But when you go to those frontline areas, they're nowhere near there. So how do you try to move them to where we are, or do you try to get them to evolve a step at a time?
I think that's a really cool comment, and I want to say that in our business, if you look at our industry, a few decades ago, it was hugely, the people who would be working in our industry came from a farming background. Very early on, their culture, was they knew sharp implements are going to cut. They knew that they had to spend dedicated time if they wanted to do it properly, all right, or don't do it at all. So they knew that, and that culture is what helped our industry get to where we are. And what I see in some of the frontline areas is folks doing, they're trying to achieve with whatever tools they have. And yeah, PPE isn't a common thing. I've seen people in flip flops using chainsaws and so forth. And your first impulse is to gasp, right? But then I'm reminded of when I first joined the business and I met a group of tree climbers who would tell me one of the safest climbers they know came from my neck of the woods, from Trinidad and Tobago, but they could not train him to climb in boots because he learned to climb without shoes, in coming from the Caribbean. And but he never recorded an accident during his career. Back then, actually, he was allowed to climb, believe it or not, in North America without shoes, which is something we would probably gasp, at right now. But that's that story, beside itself, tells us that folks are gonna evolve in their own space in their own time, and you can be a catalyst for it, and you can help the local industry work and bring their business up. But when you look at injuries in these places, it's very, very minimal. And I think it goes back to the farming days that I mentioned earlier, where a lot of these are practicing arborists in the frontline areas, or they've grown up with sharp implements. They know from a kid that that this can be done in a safe space, and there are things that they themselves wouldn't do. We would think that they're going to do everything, but they might actually tell someone, "Hey, you're holding that machete the wrong way," or you can strike someone if you swing too far back. And they themselves have their own safety code that sometimes works. So we may look at it and say, wow, how do they even survive at the end of the day? But we got to understand that there's a safety code operating. Like, I've yet to hear of an indigenous tribesman in the Amazon basin getting poked by a spear from another one. Yet they walk in single file up and down all kind of terrain, is in hand. So there is a code operating field that I think that eventually there would be formal. I think formal practicing arborists, with acceptable codes at one level internationally, and that's where work like just even this podcast is going to help.
There's so many more distractions. So like we're everybody's wearing all this protective equipment. There's manuals, there's training, yet we still have high risk incidents. We tend to have lots of incidents. Is the conversation more about distraction? You've got phones, you've got, all these other things that can affect a person's concentration, right? Versus back in the day, or some of the examples you're giving, like it was a different time, mental health was in a different place. Like there's all kinds of things today that I think are contributing factors to what may be leading to some of this stuff. Like, I know it's a complicated thing to discuss, and we're still kind of as a society figuring it all out, but have you started to shift to some of those questions and figuring out, like, okay, use of technology on a personal level, right? Like this can be a real problem, right? And how much is this contributing to real incidents?
Yeah, so it's funny, because I know we haven't talked about this before, but there is something called a light pole study that I'm involved in, and it involves people walking into light poles, being distracted, right? It used to be, like you mentioned, in the good old days when you'd walk into a light pole when you're inebriated. It's Saturday evening. You've had a good hard, you've had a good week and you're celebrating, etc. And you walk into light poles. Then we find that people are bumping, and I may be guilty of stumbling every now and again on a sidewalk here and there, but people are on their cell phones, and you're right. Technology could be distractions, and it could lead to some safety issues. Texting while driving, reading your phones, etc., is something that we got to get on top of, at a personal level, but also as an industry. It used to be fine in our industry to have a hands-free call while you're driving, right? It's no longer case in point, and you realize, well, what's changed? Now, a lot of companies are insisting that you stop, you put your vehicle in park, and you continue on the side of the road as a safe measure. So you no longer, you'd be like 10 years ago, it was fine to say, hey, yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I'm on the freeway, but I got you on speaker, and that was fine. And now it's not. So when you look at the evolution and how we can bring check-in mechanism before things get too far ahead, and I think that's where it is. It's a check-in, it's checks and balances, right? So technology, I think our advances are good, but we have to make sure they don't become a bane.
We talked about, people maybe where the life cycle they are in their career and the impact that that may have, gender as an example. But it seems to me that like there's a disconnect with language, right? You've got people out in the field performing high risk work. Is there some relationship that you've analyzed or dug into where you see possibly language being a bit of a key input to incidents, et cetera, because interpretation of safety metrics, culture, expectations, there can be a gap because information is not disseminating accurately. Have you seen that relationship?
Yeah, Taj, and that's a great question, and it's stuff lost in translation. So even though I've seen it happen with English speakers as well, where someone says A, and by the time it gets down the line, it's F.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So I think
Yep.
at the end of the day, I think we need to understand the industry. We were a very wordy, we had very, very wordy rhetoric. We had to do XYZ. You had a manual for this, you had a manual for that. And nobody reads a 300 booklet, right?
Oh, I thought you were going to say nobody reads anymore, but yes, nobody reads.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, but yeah,
Yeah, nobody reads
that
anymore.
too.
Right.
You're
But
both
the
right.
point is, I think what you bring up really revolves around training, and also we could incorporate. I understand material to for the non-English speakers, but I think we're getting to the point where we're getting back to the hieroglyphic days, right? Where we can start communicating, and people already do it. OMG, IDK. They're using these acronyms for things, and in our business, and when it comes to safety, sure, we're going to have rubric around the safety tenets, but also looking at it from the perspective of adaptive learning. So you can tell someone, hey, the coffee in this mug is hot, don't touch it. Or you can let them know, hey, what's in this cup? It's coffee. Is it hot or cold? It's hot. So right away they know by asking them what's in here and is it hot or cold, and they know it's hot. They know to themselves they don't want to put their fingers in the mug to get burned. So rather than tell people how to be safe, we need to inculcate in our training programs. I think in addition to language, there is that training evolution that we are heading toward. But I think it's positive. I think we're going to get there. It all comes back to how we provide the material, and how we base it, how we write it into our business plans and so forth. Safety should be a number one priority of any business plan we write.
I think all the utilities and the leadership state that as a priority. However, I think where sometimes the disconnect comes in is it's the execution, right? There may be a plan, uh, there's a good roadmap, there's a good blueprint, but I think the inputs, the people, how you get there, there's a lot of art and science, there's a lot of complicated elements. And to your point, I think, and I even think of myself sometimes when you're doing like corporate training, right? Like it's like you're being injected with all this information. It's just how much are you actually retaining? And so getting people to uh, understand information and making it sticky so that when they're in complicated situations, they know how to apply that information. I think that journey is complicated, right? Because it involves people. And so I think I see it from a very practical perspective, right? And so I'm trying to connect these dots, right? This incredible research, great philosophies, great ideas. And so, but at the end of the day, there's somebody on the other end who needs to take that information and execute some plan. And the amount of environmental factors that impact that execution are, there's many, right? There's performance metrics, there's a pressure to get something done, there's right. And so I'd be interested to see as your data evolves, when you factor in some of those variables, how much things get skewed. How do you prevent that? How do you hedge against that? What are the steps that allow that blueprint to stay true to making sure that in fact safety is the priority. It'll be interesting to see the evolution of your research.
Yeah, I agree. I think the execution, is a big piece of it. And one of the things we tend to leave out in our considerations is time allotments for a task, and even in training we talk about, okay, we're gonna dedicate this much in a budget for training. What does that translate in terms of time management training? What does that translate into? Time is, people say time is money, right? We got to say time is safety. We gotta start there.
If you can get that tagline out there, I'll buy you a really nice dinner.
Yeah, there you go. I'm working on it.
So, Anand, we probably need to wrap this up. Before we go, though, what would you like to leave the audience with?
I think the message of time. We live in an interesting period in our development, human development, and I think time is of the essence. And also, like I said earlier, time is safety, time is productivity. Let's find a balance. And I think, yeah,
love it.
Yeah, very good.
Dr.
Well,
Persad,
thank you for being with us, Anand.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of the Trees and Lines podcast, brought to you by Iapetus Infrastructure Services. If you like the show, please give us a rating of 5 stars on Apple or Spotify. If you have any questions or comments on any of our episodes or ideas for topics or guests in the future, we'd love to hear from you. Please contact us at treesandlines@iapetusllc.com. We'll chat with you soon.